Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Today is Monday, June 26, 2023. Thank you so much for joining me. Later in today's episode, I will be speaking with Leah Goodridge, who is the managing attorney for housing policy for the Mobilization for Justice Legal Fund, which focuses on housing justice in the city of New York, which is, like most of this country, facing a housing crisis.
New York City is staring down the worst affordability crisis of the last 2 decades. Half of the city households cannot afford to live here. They don't have enough money to comfortably hold down an apartment, food, healthcare. I've been a tenants' rights attorney for over a decade, and honestly, this is the worst I've seen it.
The first part of that interview is coming up later in today's episode, but first we take our attention to Moscow and the Wagner Group, who over the weekend created somewhat of a historic moment as they challenged the power and the authority of Vladimir Putin.
The Wagner Group's mutiny is over, but its consequences are not. Yevgeny Prigozhin. On Saturday morning, he said his Wagner forces would march to Moscow. By Saturday night, his destination had changed to Belarus.
Now, the Wagner Group is the key private military corporation that Vladimir Putin has been using in the invasion of Ukraine. They are also very active throughout the continent of Africa. They have been credibly accused of war crimes, including some 500 civilians who were killed and buried in a mass grave. This is a group that, despite them challenging the power of Vladimir Putin, is not the type of organization that you want in control of nuclear weapons. And so while the coup has ended and Vladimir Putin is still in power and the war in Ukraine is still going on, it is a sigh of relief for the stability of the entire planet that a person like Prigozhin did not get his hands on nuclear weapons. That said, Prigozhin and the Wagner Group did deal a significant blow to the reputation, the stature, and the internal power of Vladimir Putin with this coup that came to an end as a result of negotiations between the Wagner Group's leader, Prigozhin, Vladimir Putin, and the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. So what started off over the weekend as being one of the most significant, potentially shaping up to be one of the most significant weekends in world history, comparable only to that of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, which Vladimir Putin alluded to in his speech, in his only televised speech as a result of this coup. The weekend ended anticlimactically. And you know what? That's a win. When we consider the alternative was to put nuclear weapons in the hands of someone like Prigozhin, who literally used a sledgehammer to kill a defector. You know, he is not the type of person that you want around that kind of power. Most certainly, we did not need Prigozhin to have access to Russia's nuclear armaments. And so it's better served for humanity that the weekend ended anticlimactically in this way. And there is also the reality of the destabilization of Vladimir Putin's internal power, domestic power there in the nation of Russia as it moves forward in its continued invasion of Ukraine. This did present an opportunity for the Ukrainians, potentially as a way of ending this war. It would have been poetic if the Wagner Group had undermined Vladimir Putin to the point where he had to leave power. But it was just entirely too risky of a possibility for these weapons to fall into the hands of a person who would clearly take that as an opportunity to forward his own personal financial gain. And that is who the Wagner Group's leader, Prigozhin, that is who he is. One bit of commentary before we go on this particular topic. The amount of people who bought into the right-wing talking point that this coup was sponsored by Joe Biden and the CIA. I just want to address that really quickly because there were, of course, the MAGA Republicans and conservatives who always look for some way to make everything about Joe Biden, came up with that talking point and it began spreading all over social media to the point of absurdity. You even had some leftists, some former comrades of mine who bought into it and believe that this is an example of the CIA trying to do regime change. Now, to be sure, clearly, anyone who has studied, even remotely studied the CIA, understands that they are very capable of committing regime changes. They have a long track record of successfully overthrowing governments and installing their puppets, someone they can control, especially if we're considering that this is a nuclear power. If the CIA were to overthrow a nuclear power, it is certainly going to be the case that they're not going to install someone who could potentially use a nuclear weapon simply to increase his bottom line, okay, his personal bottom line. The CIA, I'm laughing about this because, it's the CIA has such a horrible track record because of what they have done in terms of overthrowing governments that it becomes so easy to blame them for everything. But I just really wanted people to take in consideration the lapse of logic here to suggest that the CIA would coup a nuclear power and install someone as erratic and uncontrollable as Prigozhin. And to think that they would do that in order to distract, this was the actual talking point, to distract from what's going on with Hunter Biden. Okay. That's like, I don't even have a good comparison, but that's like blowing up the city of New York because you saw a spider. Okay. That's how absurd that thinking is. But that did not stop people from spreading that and really just deeply believing it because of the track record of the CIA. And that therein lies the problem. It's the ease with which these propaganda points and these lies can spread. And it's rooted in the fact that the CIA is, they are the people who love to overthrow democracies and install dictators, especially if they can control that dictator. But does anyone under the sound of my voice actually think that the CIA could control Prigozhin? And then even furthermore, do you think that the United States of America would put nuclear weapons that could destroy the United States of America and the entire planet into the hands of someone as reckless as Prigozhin? Which is why it's far more likely, in my estimation, based on everything that I've ever studied, that the CIA would more likely be involved in the negotiated truce between Vladimir Putin and Prigozhin, Wagner's group Prigozhin, that was fostered by Belarus's president, Alexander Lukashenko. It's far more likely that they were involved in fostering that peace than they would be turning nuclear weapons over into the hands of a man that is far more destructive than Vladimir Putin, a man who actually does not care about his war crimes being public, has no desire whatsoever to give any illusion that he is a statesman. He is a mercenary with an army of people behind him, which, last but not least, should be a warning to every nation to stop using these private military contractors. Period. So, over the weekend, Proud Boys, who themselves are Nazis, just to be clear, if you never heard of the Proud Boys, they are a fascist organization. They allegedly got into a confrontation with quote-unquote feds. Because this is the new thing that conservatives are doing, or this new propaganda technique that conservatives are doing to give themselves plausible deniability. They're trying to create distance between themselves and their outright fascists, those groups that proudly wave Nazi flags, those groups that proudly come out and do Hitler's Sieg Heil salute. Conservatives are trying to distance themselves from their more radical elements. And I laugh about that because they all want the same thing. They just have different levels of comfort in public about how they say it or demonstrate it. Well, over the weekend, there was a confrontation at the Oregon City Pride Parade between Proud Boys, who came to protest the Pride Parade, and another group that came to protest the Pride Parade that were initially identified as the neo-Nazi group Rose City Nationalists. Now, later on in the day, there was, of course, what conservatives always do. They find a talking point that their dullards can cling on to and spread. And so the new talking point that came out of it was that Rose City Nationalist neo-Nazi organization, that they were federal agents. That's what they're doing now. And there was a confrontation. Like, these guys actually started fighting each other, and they ripped off the mask of some of the so-called neo-Nazis. And I say so-called neo-Nazis because the Proud Boys themselves are neo-Nazis. They just, again, have to create that plausible deniability so that they can continue to come in public. The Proud Boys and other groups like the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo Boys, they're all the same. They want to be able to operate in public without being called Nazis, even though they have Nazis in their ranks and their ideologies is purely fascism. But I digress. The problem with this strategy by conservatives is that the Nazis keep popping up everywhere with their swastika flags, particularly in the Southeast. The state of Florida, every time Ron DeSantis has an event, but even before he announced that he was running for president, he was at a Turning Points USA event about a year ago where neo-Nazis showed up with their three different types of flags. They had Confederate flags, they had swastika flags, and they had DeSantis country flags. That wasn't the only time they showed up. They showed up again in front of Disney World with the same flags. And then over the weekend in Cobb County, Georgia, and this one is the real one I wanted to talk about, photographs came out of neo-Nazi protesters, and I say that protesters in quotation marks, in front of a synagogue, waving swastika flags. Now, if you go to my timeline or if you look up Cobb County Nazis, you will see the photos of these individuals. And I would just say that none of these individuals could pass the physical exam for the federal to be a federal agent. None of them. And all of them were completely, just any stereotypical, which I won't give. I'll just conjure them up in your mind. Any stereotypical Southern joke that you can make about, people in the South, especially racist in the South. That's exactly what these people look like. And I only bring that up because I'm really curious. Has the standard for being a federal agent, has it fallen so much that, Betty Sue, who I won't discuss her weight because I'm a big guy myself, or Jim Bob, I won't discuss his dental situation because I got to go see a dentist. I haven't been to a dentist since the pandemic began, but I just want you to picture those. Go look at the pictures yourself and make your assessment. It's going to be really hard to blame this on federal agents. The guys in Oregon City that they claim were federal agents, at least they were in shape enough to actually pass the physical exam to be a federal agent. But the people who are out here flying these swastika flags in Georgia, no, they came from right around the woodshed on the backside of Stone Mountain somewhere in the highest concentration of necks that are extremely red. It's going to be hard for them to really continue to pull off this propaganda game of plausible deniability, because some of these quote unquote federal agents waving swastika flags look like they really need to be riding in a hover-round, and not because of their age.
Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and get twice the content and unfiltered interviews without any of the commercial interruptions. Welcome back to The Benjamin Dixon Show. Visit us online at thebenjamindixonshow.com.
Welcome back. I had a chance to speak with Leah Goodrich, who is the managing attorney for housing policy for the Mobilization for Justice Legal Fund, which is an organization that focuses on housing justice in the city of New York, which is, like most of this country, facing a housing crisis that is worse than anything we've seen in our lifetimes.
I am a tenants' rights attorney. I work at an organization called Mobilization for Justice, and I've been in the tenant movement for a little over a decade. I represent tenants who are facing eviction. I am basically on the front lines of the housing crisis because I get to hear stories of New Yorkers every day. Almost all of my clients are Black and brown. For me, it is really important to speak up about the housing crisis because there is racialized displacement. It is mostly people of color who are impacted disproportionately. New York City is staring down the worst affordability crisis of the last 2 decades. According to a recent report, which is called Fund of the City, half of the city households cannot afford to live here. That means that they don't have enough money to comfortably hold down an apartment, food, healthcare. I've been a tenants' rights attorney for over a decade, and honestly, this is the worst I've seen it. People are scared. They're scared because rent stabilization in of itself is possibly going to go to the Supreme Court and maybe dismantled. I am part of many organizations that provide free legal services. And the funding for that, the right to counsel funding, that's underfunded. So tenants are scared about that because it means that they have less likelihood of getting an attorney. Right to shelter is being threatened by the mayor.
That's Mayor Eric Adams, the Black Democratic mayor of the city of New York.
Manhattan, which is one of the 5 boroughs, the median rent is over $4,000. So, it's just there's a lot to be scared about. There's a lot to be anxious about. And this is why at the last Rent Guidelines Board meeting, at the preliminary vote, people jumped on the stage. People are anxious, people are scared, and people are angry. People are angry.
The housing crisis that we are facing is nationwide. It is happening all over the country. We see, like Leah stated, in cities like New York, as well as cities like San Francisco, and even cities across the Southeast, like Jacksonville, Florida. There is a homelessness crisis that has been completely and not only ignored by the leaders that we elect into office, but now it's being exacerbated by some of the very leaders that have been elected into office, not only through the defunding of programs like Leah's program, but also through the criminalization of homelessness.
I don't think a lot of people know the intentions and all of the thought behind laws that go into punishing people who are poor, and specifically people who do not have homes. So, it can range from the architecture that a city may put down to, try to prevent people from laying there. But then there are also more stringent types of measures, like a city or a state may actually have laws making it a crime to sleep on a bench or to sleep in a public park. And those are specifically targeting homeless people. So it's not just that, it's one thing if you make it, you give someone a fine or you say you're not allowed to do this. It's another thing if you can actually put them in jail for it.
Keep in mind, putting them in jail costs taxpayers more money per night than it would cost to give these people shelter in many cases. We also got a chance to talk about the structural problems that lead to the housing crisis and the affordability crisis, the structural problems in terms of capitalism, and the fact that many landlords are making decisions that are in their best economic interest, which happens to be in direct competition with the interest of renters.
There's a housing crisis. This is part of regulation. We're going to have to regulate to have lower rent. So it is what it is. When you make a business decision to purchase a building and you know that it is going to be regulated by the government, you are making a choice. No one's forcing you to buy that building. These talking points that say, oh my God, that's out of my hands. It's like you made a decision. This is not an uninformed decision. You knew that the building was rent stabilized. You walked into it knowing that. You know that it's going to be regulated. So for the talking point to be, I can't believe it's being regulated, it doesn't make sense to me. But then they also bring up, well, what about what anyone else is doing to help the housing crisis? And you know what? They have a point. Now, I'll say specifically other things that should be happening. is more affordable housing should be built. The point is the city and the state needs to be at the forefront of pushing policies and creating more affordable housing that's actually affordable.
That's Leah Goodrich. She is the managing attorney for housing policy for the Mobilization for Justice Fund. We'll have part 2 of her interview tomorrow. Follow her on Twitter, Leah from Brooklyn, BKLYN. There's another crisis that is spreading around this country, and it is a crisis of violence and hatred and bigotry that is targeting the LGBTQIA community. And I have covered this, and I cover this as a Black Christian man, father, pretty conservative in my own personal life. I would not take my kids to a drag show. I've never even been to a drag show, so it's just not my thing. But the fact of the matter is, just based on the sheer volume of evidence of mugshots that we have of the actual culprits that are committing these acts of sexual assault against our children, your children would be safer at a drag show than they would be at any of these churches that now have committed so many acts of sexual assault against children and protected the offenders that they now have their own line of insurance, their own specific type of insurance to cover churches in case they are sued for sexually assaulting a child. Google it. I've covered it before, but if you've never heard of it, just throw that in your search engine and definitely be careful of how you phrase that, right? But as I begin to call these institutions and these preachers, priests, and pastors out, of course, they're not happy about it, because the number one tool that is being used to galvanize this white supremacist Christian nationalist movement that is taking over this country is the hatred and bigotry that they can foster and foment to the top of the discourse around and targeting the LGBTQIA community. This is by far the most successful recruiting tool the conservative movement has ever come up with, because they're not only now getting Black people to co-sign with supremacists, to march in concert with white supremacists, they're even getting Muslims who were just the victims of the war on terror, which is still ongoing, by the way. You have Muslims now lining up with the very people who celebrated George W. Bush bombing their folks in the Middle East. So this is by far the most successful recruiting campaign of the white supremacist Nazi movement, fascist movement that is taking over this country. And the irony of it is it's being headed up by the culprits. It is just a fact. Look at the mugshot. Somebody, and I really wish someone would do an empirical study of it, but just on the sheer volume of cases that we get on a regular basis of youth pastors, deacons, pastors, priests who are committing these acts of sexual assault against our children, and the lack of examples that you can find. You may be able to find an outlier of a drag queen. I still have not found that outlier, by the way, but I'm just trying to give for the possibility. I'm trying to take in consideration the possibility that there are cases that I don't know about. But when we do the search and when the mugshots hit the screens, because there are quite a few people who are now committed to exposing this, not just me. There are people who are doing the research and bringing to the front of the conversation pastor after pastor, minister after minister, deacon after deacon, youth leader after youth leader who have been found guilty and are currently serving prison sentences for raping children. And it is the height of absurdity and irony that these are the same people who are tearing down signs across Florida. There was an ad campaign promoting and celebrating Pride Month in the state of Florida, and those billboards have now started to been torn down all across the state. The people who are acting the most violent towards the LGBTQIA community are literally the demographic that is doing the assault. It goes beyond projection. It goes beyond scapegoating. It has become a galvanizing, organizing tool that is being wielded by the very culprits, the very demographic, the very organizations and institutions that are committing these assaults. For example, Catholic churches showing up to counter-protest the pride parades. See, everyone is triggered because at the pride parades, you got a couple of naked people who are marching around. Listen, I'd never go to a pride parade with my kids. I probably wouldn't go by myself. Just I think I actually inadvertently ended up at one in Miami when I was real young with the fellas, and we were down on South Beach trying to holler at women, and we realized we got there and it was Pride weekend. I was like, oop, time for me to go. So it's not my world. It's not my thing, right? But to think that Catholic churches are showing up to protest pride parades in the name of protecting our children, and they haven't done excuse my language, God, a damn thing to protect the children in their diocese and their different in their different churches. The absurdity of it all. And then you have these Southern Baptist kids who all showed up at a pride parade to protest the pride parade this summer. And I'm like, wait a minute. Do you know that as a matter of statistical significance, you can get more bang for your buck protesting your own churches than you would protesting at a pride event? You would get the most bang for your buck going after cisgendered straight men than you would going after any of the LGBTQIA community. And one of the most disturbing things about this right now is, even as I, confront this on social media or in person, it's the disturbing reality of how many people don't even include young girls in their definition of sexual assault or pedophilia, right? They only see young boys as victims. And I wonder why that is. That's because that gives them another level of plausible deniability to blame it on the LGBTQIA community versus the true culprits, cisgendered straight men in positions of authority. Getting ready to go to the patrons only portion of the show, patreon.com/the BPD show, to get access to the second half. But before I close the public show, I've got to come full circle to what happened in Russia over the weekend with the Wagner group. More specifically, the paid Putin propagandists, who, quite honestly, they are the very best of Vladimir Putin's army. Not his soldiers, but his propagandists. They had to reveal this weekend who and what they truly are. While they are currently going underneath this twisted and bastardized interpretation of anti-war, they claim to be anti-war. These are the people who claim that Vladimir Putin going into Ukraine was an act of anti-war. Okay, an act of war. I just got to double down on what's going on. The act of war that was committed by Vladimir Putin is being championed as an act of anti-war by the paid propagandists. How they pull it off inside of their head, without the cognitive dissonance giving them an aneurysm, I do not know. Maybe their brains are a little bit bigger than we thought, because to hold that level of dissonance in your brain should cause them a stroke, and hopefully it does. But I digress. They had to reveal themselves this weekend because if the Wagner group had completed their mission as defined by Prigozhin, it most certainly would have represented the end of Vladimir Putin's imperialist expansion into Ukraine. And it also most certainly would have marked an end to many of their paychecks. But thankfully, in their case, they can rest easily because, well, their checks are going to continue, as well as, unfortunately, the war in Ukraine will continue. But that just screams of a parallel to the very people who are claiming to protect our children being the culprits, their institutions being the culprits, just like these people who are claiming to be anti-war are celebrating the fact that Vladimir Putin can continue his war in Ukraine, his unjust and war of imperialism in Ukraine. That's my music. I'll talk more about it in the patrons episode, patreon.com/the BPD show. Everyone else, I'll see you tomorrow.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.patreon.com/the BPD show. and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.